What is a Hebrew? What does the word Hebrew mean? The word Hebrew is derived from the Hebrew word for Hebrew, Iberi, or Iberi, from the root abar, to pass over. It is cognate. It's related to the English words over and other and either, and has a similar meaning or a similar connotation. It means on the other side. The Midrash says that Abraham stood on one side and all the rest of the world stood on the other. Abraham was the first Hebrew recorded in the Bible. Joseph is also referred to as Hebrew. Joseph came from the land of the Hebrews. Whatever its origin, the name in the Bible is associated with Israelites. It is synonymous with Israelites. And this name adapted to Western forms of pronunciation became Hiberi, was the name applied to the people of the West, the so-called Celtic peoples. They did not call themselves Celts. Celts is a name, a relatively recent name, adapted from Roman terminology. It's not the name they applied to themselves. We do not know what name as a group they applied to themselves, or even to what degree these peoples in the West, who were in Western Europe, in the British Isles, in Ireland, in France, in Belgium, in the north, we do not know to what degree they even recognized each other as belonging to the one nation. But culturally they did. Culturally they were all one group, was considered all one group, and they all had similar languages, it is assumed. At least most of them did. And they were known as Celts in conventional historical terms. They probably called themselves something like Hiberi, because some of them are known by this term, Iberi, or they have in their genealogical lists people under that name, under the name Heber and so on. Also in place names, that the roots, names bearing the root Iber, Ebro, Abba, all meaning over, or meaning the same as Hebrew. That is the most common name we find. It is an ethnic name. And we understand that these peoples are in effect descendants from Hebrews. We also find the name in areas where they ceased to be the dominant element. For instance, in Spain, they once ruled over Spain and they moved out of Spain on the whole. They left the name Heber and Iberi behind them. That's where we get the name Iberian Peninsula for Spain and Portugal. At all events, Heber was the name they applied to themselves. Heber means Hebrew. It's the same as Hebrew. And we have shown elsewhere that they descended from the Hebrews. The Hebrews were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was also known as Israel. There were 12 tribes of Israel. 12 tribes of Israel. These tribes divided into two different sections. The northern section had established its own kingdom, its own domain, with 10 tribes, and these 10 tribes were conquered by the Assyrians and taken into exile. From their places of exile, they later moved out. They went to the north, they went to the west, and eventually they converged in Western Europe. And the Bible indicates that that is where they are to be found. And this is confirmed by rabbinical sources and other sources, and by historical sources. That is where the lost 10 tribes are. So at present we'll look at this term Hebrew in the Bible. We'll also see what the name connotes and what significance It has for us Abraham, Isaac and Jacob were the forerunners of the Israelite nation, of the Hebrew people. Jacob was renamed Israel. Israel had 12 sons. One of these sons was Joseph. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, or Manasseh in Hebrew, Ephraim and Manasseh. And these two sons became tribes in their own right. And descendants of these two sons are to be found amongst Western peoples. Those of Ephraim are dominant amongst the English-speaking peoples of Britain and offshoots of Britain, whereas America has the domain, whereas the USA is the domain of Manasseh, even though both Ephraim and Manasseh are to be found in the USA and throughout all areas where members of the lost in tribes are to be found. Joseph is also used as a generic name, for the lost 10 tribes in general. We find in the Bible, in Psalms 80 it says, "Listen, O shepherd of Israel, he who leads Joseph's descendants, the descendants of Joseph like a flock, O God, enthroned above the cherubim, and the angels above the angels, display your radiant glory." We also find in Amos chapter 5 it says, "Hate evil and love good. Hate evil, love good. Establish judgment in the gates." It may be that the Lord God of hosts will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. Maybe that the Lord God of hosts will be generous to the remnant of Joseph. Joseph, meaning the 10 tribes in this case, all of the 10 tribes, but especially the descendants of Joseph. And Joseph was a great-grandson of Abraham. Abraham was the first Hebrew, then Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob is known as Israel, Israel begat 12 tribes, 12 sons, and one of them was Joseph. Joseph is also referred to in the Bible several places as the Hebrew. Joseph was known as the Hebrew lad, the Hebrew servant. Is mentioned that he was a Hebrew. And Abraham had been known as the Hebrew. In Genesis 14:13 it says, but when in Genesis 14:13 it tells us that Abraham was then known as Abram, and for his name was changed to Abraham. Abraham came from the north together with his nephew Lot, and they came into the land of Canaan. Lot went to the east of the Jordan. On the east of the Jordan, 4 kings from Mesopotamia from the north came down and attacked the area. They took Lot away, captive, and one of the members of Lot's party escaped and went to Abraham and told him what had taken place. Abraham got his men together and chased after the kings and overtook them, and he rescued his nephew Lot. So it says, when they're relating how Abraham received the news, it says in Genesis 14:13, but one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove, belonging to Mamre. He was living near the oak grove belonging to Mamre, that is near Hebron, belonging to Mamre the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives, Eshcol and Anna, were allies of Abraham. Later we also find Moses. Moses described as a Hebrew. That Moses, when the Egyptians were when the Hebrews were in Egypt, they increased and multiplied. The king of Egypt did not want so many Hebrews around, so he ordered that all the children, all the boys, Hebrew boys, should be thrown into the Nile. And Moses was placed in a basket, in a floating basket in the Nile. And the daughter of Pharaoh rescued him, and he grew up in the palace of Pharaoh. When he was grown, he went out to see what was taking place with his people, with the Hebrews. The Hebrews, it says, was taking place with the Hebrews, and he saw what was going on. And it says in Exodus, it says in Exodus 2:21, many years later, Moses had many years later when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his people, the Hebrews, and he saw how they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews, and he killed the Egyptian, and he fled. He fled to the area of Midian, where he married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. Later, Moses was in the wilderness, and God appeared unto him and told him to return to Egypt and to bring the Hebrews, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And he was told, see Exodus 3:18, the elders of Israel will accept your message. Then you and the elders must go to the king of Egypt and tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So please let us take a 3-day journey to the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. And they are told to go to Pharaoh. In Exodus 7:16, then announce to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to tell you, let my people go, let my people go, so they can worship me in the wilderness. Until now you have refused to listen to him. And again in Exodus 9, go back to Pharaoh, the Lord commanded Moses, tell him this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go, so they can worship me. So we find Jonah the prophet. Jonah the prophet defined himself as a Hebrew. Jonah the prophet was told to go to Nineveh and rebuke the pagans there to better their ways, and he didn't want to do so, and he tried to flee. He took a ship going to Tarshish in Spain, and on the way the ship he was in was beset by a storm. A storm came down on it, and it came down on it in such a way that it was supernaturally focused on the ship. And the sailors of the ship, they were apparently from several different countries, and they knew that something supernatural was taking place, and that it must be connected with one of them. So they cast lots to see who the culprit was, and it came on Jonah. So they asked Jonah who he was, and we're told in Jonah chapter 1, the crew cast lots to see which of them the crew cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and caused a terrible storm. When they did this, the lots identified Jonah. They identified Jonah as the culprit. Why has this awful storm come down on us? They demanded. Who are you? What is your life? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality? Jonah answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. We find Joseph described as a Hebrew. Joseph was the favorite son of his father Jacob. His brothers were jealous of him. They suspected him of intending to do them harm, damage, and so they deliberated as to what to do with him. And at one stage they thought of killing him. Then they threw him in a pit to leave him to the mercy of the elements. And a caravan of Midianites, Ishmaelites came by, and so they drew him up out of the pit, and they sold him to these people, going down to Egypt, and in Egypt he was bought as a slave by Potiphar, one of the officials of the king. And Potiphar placed him in charge of all his estate, of all his household. And since he was, the Bible describes him as of a good appearance and good form, young, attractive, the wife of Pharaoh wanted to sleep with him, and he refused. So she accused him of attempted rape, and she described him as a Hebrew slave. Genesis 39:14 says, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. Look, she said, my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And again in Genesis 39:17 it says, then she told him a story that is her husband, that Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me, she said. So Joseph was placed in prison. Whilst he was in prison, he's put in charge of the prison, of the other prisoners. And it happened that the two of the servants of Pharaoh, the cupbearer, and the cupbearer, the steward, and the baker, they offended Pharaoh, so he placed them in prison. And they each had dreams, and Joseph noticed that they had that they were downcast, that they were troubled. He asked them what was the matter. They told him about their dreams, and Joseph solved their dreams, interpreted their dreams for him. And he told the cupbearer that he would be restored to his position. And he asked the cupbearer that when that happens, that he should remember him and put in a good word for him. And he says, as he says in Genesis 40:15, for I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews. He describes his land as the land of the Hebrews. And now I'm in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. It happened after 2 years, after the cupbearer had been restored. Pharaoh too had several dreams, and no one could interpret them. But the cupbearer remembered Joseph, and he spoke of him, and he recommended him to Pharaoh. And he said, there was in Genesis 41:12, there was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us each what our dreams meant. And so Joseph was brought to Pharaoh, and he interpreted for Pharaoh the dreams that he had, successfully solving the problem and helping Pharaoh, giving Pharaoh advice as what to do. So Pharaoh made him the chief official of the kingdom. And then the brothers of Joseph came down to Egypt in order to buy grain, and they met up with Joseph, and they did not know who Joseph was. But eventually Joseph brought them back to his house, and they ate. And it describes how the arrangements, the eating arrangements, had separated the brothers of Joseph from the rest of the attendants of Pharaoh, because they would not eat, that is, the Egyptians would not eat with the Hebrews. It says in Genesis 43:32, the waiters served Joseph at his own table, and his brothers were served at a separate table. The Egyptians who ate with Joseph sat at their own table, because Egyptians despise Hebrews and refused to eat with them. So the Hebrews were despised and separated. And that is what the early Israelites were. They were Hebrews. As we saw, eventually the descendants of Joseph, became the leading elements amongst the 10 tribes. They were exiled with the 10 tribes. They lost the consciousness of their ancestry along with the 10 tribes. And they settled in the West, in the British, and they became English-speaking peoples, or a good portion of them. And they are still there. That is where they are, and they identified with those peoples, and they have the aspects of Joseph. It was prophesied that Joseph would become a great nation, that he would rule over other peoples, that he would have a worldwide empire and domains in all of the seas, and that he would be rich and enjoy agricultural bounty and mineral resources, the use of mineral resources and riches and numerous multitudinous populations would come out of him, and that is what we find. It's also said that the descendants of Joseph would be the leading elements amongst the peoples of the world, the leading military power, and possess major strategic positions and interpasses and so on. That is also what we find, first amongst the British and now amongst the Americans. Now they may be losing a bit of what they had, but we're reading, we are getting up until the end times, and things are changing, and there could be troubles in store for all of us, but eventually, with the help of God, we shall survive and come through this. But we need to know who we are. We need to know whether or not we are descended from Joseph, we're descended from the 10 tribes of Israel, or from Judah. We should know this. This is for our benefit. So some of the, so it's worth considering to what degree we have the characteristics of Joseph. So we saw that Joseph was known as being concerned with others. He had a scientific attitude, a rational, and also inspired, and he had his faults, he had his virtues, as we have mentioned in this series, and one of these apparently is connected with him being characterized as a Hebrew, having the characteristics of a Hebrews. One of the characteristics of Hebrews is to be prepared to take the opposite position, to take a minority position, to go against the mainstream, to believe in the truth as you understand it, and not to be ashamed of it, and to be prepared to stand up for it, even though that we also all need to do this with circumspection, with rationality, with sensitivity towards the feelings and the needs of others, such as Joseph did have. Joseph was sensitive to other peoples, to how they thought and how they acted. He did take consideration of them. So this is also an attitude, an attribute of Joseph. And we all need this. We also need the guidance of God Almighty. Joseph and Moses and Jonah and all of them, they also all mentioned and all spoke of the God of the Hebrews. We need to reach out to the God of the Hebrews to help us, to guide us, to help us to do the right thing. Thank you.